I know all of you here tonight, or most of you, are interested in the Israel-Palestine side of all of this. So I thought I would shift a little bit to talk about that. But don't forget the context in which all of this is going forward. It's a very grim moment. We saw that this summer in the latest Israeli war on Gaza, 50 days of bombardment that led to the deaths of almost 2,200 Palestinians, of whom 30% were children. 6 Israelis were killed. 4 of the 6 were soldiers, only 2 civilians, luckily. The Palestinians weren't so lucky. Overwhelmingly, they were civilians. And Israeli occupation has not changed. You know, we hear a lot in the debates in Washington about the Obama administration being tough on Israel. If you remember back in 2010, that was the summer that Netanyahu came to Washington, and there was that sort of tense set of interactions between Bibi Netanyahu and Barack Obama. There was the finger shaking of Obama, against Obama by Netanyahu, and a lot of criticism of Obama because he kind of sat there and took it. And what we were hearing, what the press was saying, was, oh my God, he's criticizing Israel. He's throwing Israel under a bus. He's abandoning Israel. Well, there was no bus. Nobody abandoned anybody. What we saw was not even an end to settlements. What we saw was a series of requests. Please stop building settlements. Answer, no. Please stop building settlements. No. And then they stopped asking. Now, if there had been real pressure, if there had been the kind of pressure I think there needs to be, it would have gone a little bit differently. Please stop building settlements. Answer, no. Okay, you're an independent country. You can do what you want. But you know that $3.2 billion of military aid we give you every year? You can kiss that goodbye. And you know how we protect you in the United Nations so that you're never held accountable and your political and military leaders never have to worry about being held accountable for war crimes? We're not doing that anymore. That's the beginning of what pressure looks like. That's not sanctions. That's just taking away some privileges. Then you can start talking about pressure. We never saw anything remotely like that. And we're still not seeing that. What we're seeing is that finally, this last April, we heard officially what many observers and everybody in the region pretty much has known for a very long time, that the US-based, US-controlled negotiations that have been going on for now 23 years have failed. Two-state solution with swaps. You have to say it really fast. Two-state solution with swaps. Because there can't be any, you can't break up any of those terms. You can't say swaps. What are we swapping for what? 2 states? Really, what state are we talking about for the Palestinian state? Is it going to be contiguous? Is it going to be viable? Is it going to be sovereign? Is it going to control its own borders, its own airspace? And the answer is, of course not. None of that is on the table. So what a surprise that these negotiations failed. The only change in April was that finally, the State Department and the White House admitted it. These negotiations ain't going nowhere. And many people, myself included, I confess, were very pleased to hear that. Because the illusion of peace talks had led to 23 years of Israeli expansion of settlements, of expansion of an apartheid system in which one government has all the power in one piece of land, in which different populations determined on the basis of religion and ethnicity face different political and legal systems. That's the definition of apartheid. All of that expanded during those 23 years. The Oslo mythology was that both sides have an interest. The reality, sadly, on the ground, the reason it never worked when people would say, well, the Israelis have to come to the table because it's in their interest. The status quo is not viable. The problem is, for Israelis, the status quo is quite viable. The status quo is quite viable. Imagine that the violence stopped today for 24 hours. Everything remains in place, but there's no violence. What does that mean for Israelis? Israel is the 23rd wealthiest country in the world per capita. It has the 11th most powerful military in the world, the 4th most powerful nuclear arsenal. It has the backing of the world's sole superpower. Its passports are welcome everywhere. Israelis travel the world. They have advanced access to culture and science, education, healthcare. Life is good. Every once in a while, there's a small upsurgence of violence here and there. It's horrifying at those moments. But Israelis have not lost thousands and thousands of people in these recent years, in those 23 years. It's quite a viable status quo. Now imagine for the Palestinians living in the occupied territories. We won't even talk about Palestinians inside Israel or the refugees, but just those living within the occupied territory. Let's look at what they would face. There's no violence, right? But they are still living under occupation. There are still physical barriers that separate their towns from the refugee camps nearby, that separate the cities from the villages. Maybe nobody's shooting at them at that day, that's a good thing, but they still can't move, they can't build an economy. Israeli settlements still separate their villages and towns and refugee camps from each other. The wall that the Palestinians call the apartheid wall, actually the Israelis call it that too. They just use the word in Hebrew. You know, apartheid means separation. Hafradah is the Hebrew word for separation. In English, we say separation. So everybody calls it the same thing, it just has different resonance with different languages, right? But the wall doesn't really separate Palestinians from Israelis. It separates Palestinians from each other. Because if you imagine the West Bank, you all have those flyers that you picked up, you've got your little map. If you imagine on the map where there are Palestinian towns, villages, cities, refugee camps, and there are Israeli settlements, some of which are the size of cities. You know, we hear the word settlement and we think, you know, hardy pioneers with tents on a hilltop with barrels of water and a few dogs to protect the sheep or something. That's what I used to think when I was a kid growing up in Zionist summer camp. That was kind of our image, you know. But these are cities. You know, Ma'ale Adumim. How many of you have ever been to the West Bank? Quite a few of you. The town of Ma'ale Adumim, it's a settlement outside of Jerusalem. It has 40,000 people. It's a city. It's a city. It has 2 high schools. It has a junior college. It has an aircraft maintenance school. It's a pretty beautiful city. It sort of looks like the suburbs of LA. So these are big cities. The way it works in the Palestinian territory is that if you imagine Swiss cheese, Israeli-controlled territory is the cheese. The Palestinian towns, villages, and camps are the holes. The cheese is what's attached to each other. It's contiguous. The Israeli pieces are not. They're separated. And part of that is because of the apartheid wall. Sorry, Palestinians, right? So the problem is not that there's negotiations. There needs to be negotiations. The question is, based on what? Based on the continuation of U.S. power that embraces the U.S.-backed Israeli settlement process? So that what we're negotiating is what percentage of the 60% that Israel says they're willing to talk about of the 22% of historic Palestine. We will never talk about the historic compromise that the Palestinians made in 1988 when they recognized Israel and said, we are prepared to have a state not in all of what was once Palestine, but in the 22% that was left after the war of 1947-48. It was a huge historic compromise, which many Palestinians opposed. But it was a brave move by a leadership that felt they had no choice but to make that compromise. Now, it's as if that never happened, that the only issue that anybody would ever want to talk about would be the 22%, which is the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and what part of that could become a Palestinian state. Well, that's where we get to two-state solution with swaps, because that's where you get to what in Washington they like to talk about as facts on the ground. We have to recognize the facts on the ground, which means that the illegality goes away if you can just manage long enough. You know, that settlements somehow become legal And they just are there, so you have to deal with them. Instead of saying they were illegal when they were built, and they're illegal today. And we now have 650,000 illegal Jewish settlers in the occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem who are violating international law every morning just by getting out of bed, because their home is built on expropriated land. Now, interestingly, more and more people in the United States are starting to get that. There was a fascinating poll. I mean, polls are of dubious value, let's be clear. Polls are like photographs. They say something about a moment, but they can tell you something that can be kind of astonishing, and then you remember that moment. Remember I was talking a few minutes ago about what happened in 2010 when there was all the fighting between the US and Israel, and they're throwing Israel under the bus, and Bibi Netanyahu should tell Obama what to do. No. And there was all that back and forth. During that summer, the Zogby operation did a poll of Democrats and Republicans on a bunch of questions having to do with the Middle East. One of the questions had to do with settlements. And the question basically said, Israelis are building settlements throughout the occupied territory. Which of the following two statements best reflects your opinion? Statement number one, Israelis are building settlements for security reasons and they have the right to build wherever they choose. Sentence number two, Israeli settlements are violating international law and they should all be torn down and the land returned to, that they're built on expropriated land was the language. They should be torn down and the land returned to its original owners. Now, I happen to agree with sentence number two, but it's a very kind of extreme way of describing it. You could describe it slightly less extreme than that, but that's a pretty direct and in-your-face way of describing it. 63% of Democrats chose sentence number two. In the midst of that very tense summer about what US-Israeli relationships were all about. I think that's a pretty extraordinary snapshot. I don't know that you'd get the same result today. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. But it has everything to do with how the discourse in this country has been transformed. You know, I spend a lot of time on the road. I was saying earlier, I spend a lot of time in church basements. But I also spend a lot of time at universities and in weird little tiny television studios and community radio stations, and I talk to all kinds of people. And I gotta say, it's a different world out there. It's not to say that everybody agrees with me. That would be really boring, among other things. But there has been such a powerful change from years ago when I started doing this work. You know, death threats were common. The Jewish Defense League shot into my house in LA years ago. You know, that stuff doesn't happen anymore. It's a whole different world. As I say, not everybody agrees, but the conversation has been transformed. You see it in the academy. Look at all of these academic institutions that are now passing what's known as BDS resolutions, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is the global campaign to bring nonviolent economic pressure to bear on Israel to stop its violations of international law. You know, these are not arbitrary, we're going to boycott Israel because we don't like them. This is, we're going to boycott until Israel stops 3 specific sets of violations. It's very concrete, it's all spelled out in the campaign call. So it's very amazing that it's happening all over the world. In Europe, it's already had extraordinary economic impact. The largest incident of a European contract collapsing and being withdrawn was a contract by the Veolia Corporation for the City Council of Stockholm. They had a $10 billion contract to build a new light rail system across Stockholm and its environs. And they ended the contract because of the pressure being brought to bear on the Stockholm City Council by BDS activists who said, you can't do that with Veolia because Veolia is responsible for helping to build an illegal light rail system in the occupied territories. And they said, you know what? You're right. We're taking away the contract. A $10 billion contract was lost. So the impact is huge. Now, in the US, we can't claim that kind of economic power yet. But we are seeing an enormous shift in how ordinary people and ordinary institutions of our country come to understand this issue. If you look at the faith-based world that you all come to. Look at the Presbyterians and the Methodists, two of the biggest mainstream denominations in this country. And not, I would say, necessarily the most progressive. That belongs to the UUs and the Quakers in most ways, from my vantage point at least. But it wasn't the UUs, think about that, who took the initiative, who have passed these national resolutions over periods of years. Now keep in mind, this was not a one-off thing. People show up at a meeting and say, oh, we think it would be a good idea to call on our denomination to divest all of our accounts from every corporation that profits from occupation. Some people wanted to do that. But the people who work in those churches said, no, that's ridiculous. That's not how you do that. Number one, you'll lose. Number two, you won't educate anybody. Number three, you'll lose. 2 out of 3. So people started campaigning, and it took years. They did education. They did programs very much like what you're doing here, brought speakers in to talk, had book clubs, read stuff, talked to Palestinian Christians about what their lives were like, who they saw as the problem, what they saw would be the way to move forward. And after 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, you have these extraordinary resolutions being passed. First, it was boycotts, because that's a little easier. We're calling on our members to individually boycott whatever was the particular target. And then you move to the institutional side, and suddenly the institutions were calling for divestment of their institutional funds, and we're talking here in the hundreds of millions of dollars for these giant churches. So this is not some small marginal movement anymore. This is a movement that has moved right into the mainstream when none of us were looking. My colleagues in the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation, when we started 12 years ago, we had about 15 people and about 6 organizations, and we were all very nervous. Now there's over 400 member organizations, including these giant church groups. It's an incredibly different moment. It's a different political moment. The problem we face is that there's been this huge shift in the discourse, in the public discussion. In the press, there's been a significant shift. Not as much as for the public, but significant nonetheless. But when it gets to the policy, that's where we have a problem. When it gets to the policy, we don't see any significant change. There's been a couple of small changes. I don't want to minimize it. We heard during the Gaza war last summer that when Israel made its usual request to the Pentagon to replace the Hellfire missiles because it had used up its stock, the White House suddenly announced, you know what, I think from now on we're going to make sure that the White House gives permission before we just go allowing the military to send them off willy-nilly with no accountability for how they might be used. Now that's not a huge shift, because as soon as they asked the White House said yes. But the recognition that there should be some kind of accountability, that's a huge shift for the US. That's enormous. So we have to take that, I think, very seriously. You know, the Palestinians right now are facing a horrific set of circumstances. At the level of people on the ground, if you look at the situation in Gaza, where 36,000 people had their homes completely destroyed, thousands more, their homes were so damaged they can't be lived in yet, no building materials being allowed in, medical care is severely limited. Fresh water, the UN has said that 90% of the water available in Gaza, and not very much is available at all, 90% of it is not fit for human consumption. The sewage treatment plant has not been rebuilt. There is raw sewage in the streets of Gaza. Every time the floods come, every time it rains, the flooded sewage pools run out into the areas where the people are living in tents. 5 children have died in the region, not only in Gaza, 2 in Gaza, because it's been such a cold winter. The snows, it's nightmarish. In the West Bank, the physical conditions are not so bad, except for those people whose homes have been demolished. Hundreds and hundreds of homes have been demolished by the Israelis. And they're left with nothing. They're left with no tents. The UN tries to provide tents, and when they set up the tents on their own land, the tents are torn down by the Israelis. But it's not only the physical challenges that exist on the ground. It's also the sense that nothing is changing yet. You know, that nothing is oh, this really is not going to work. I need my notes, sorry. No, it's not. I need my notes here. I need to really emphasize what Palestinians are facing right now, because it's, for people who haven't been there recently, it's a very, very hard time. And internationally, things are much worse, ironically, than they were in 2012. You know, there was that short Israeli war against Gaza in 2012. It wasn't as long as Cass led in 2008, 2009. It wasn't nearly as long as this year's war, but it was still a serious war. But during that moment, that was at the height of the Arab Spring. Gaza was not isolated. Israel was isolated. You saw a host of foreign ministers from the Arab League, the Prime Minister of Egypt, the Foreign Minister of Turkey, who went to Gaza City to stand with Gaza under the bombs. It was an extraordinary moment. In 2014, you saw none of that. The military government in Egypt is now collaborating with Israel. They shut the one exit and entry point for Gaza, the Rafah crossing into Egypt, the only one not controlled by Israel, was shut by the Egyptian government, to great cheers from the Israelis and the Americans. There's been some pressure, and I heard lately, the last few days, that the crossing has been open a couple of days a week now, and there's some talk that maybe they'll be able to be convinced to open it permanently, but there's no guarantees. And the crucial point is that the people of Gaza have no influence. People of Gaza have no control over their skies, over who goes in and out, which is basically no one, goods coming in and out, which is basically nothing. None of this is under the control of the people in Gaza, the governing forces in Gaza led by Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, who is now part of a coalition government with Hamas. Together or separately, they have no power. None of them do. Israel has the power. So this notion that Gaza is no longer occupied because Israel withdrew the troops from being in the streets of Gaza City to being surrounding the territory of Gaza, that doesn't end occupation. It just changes the kind of occupation. Instead of old-fashioned colonial settler occupation, it's a siege kind of occupation. But under international law, occupation is defined not by how many soldiers happen to be on the ground at any given moment, but it's defined as having control. Who has control of Gaza? It's the Israeli military, who surrounds the wall. Gaza is walled off too. I don't know if everybody knows that. The wall isn't only in the West Bank. Gaza is completely surrounded by a wall, except for where it's out on the sea. And Israeli soldiers patrol that. They control the skies. They control the waters. Gaza fishermen are only allowed to go out 2 miles, and of course there's virtually no fish left within 2 miles. So this problem of control remains. And yet we hear the justification for the war this summer that Israel has the right to defend itself. Now, it's true, Palestinian rockets were a violation of international law, and there should be accountability. One of the interesting things about the move in the International Criminal Court, Israel actually tried, 2 Israeli officials got up there and said, you're going to talk about Israeli violations? It's Palestinians that should be held accountable. And my answer to that is, yeah, absolutely. They knew that going in and decided it was important enough to at least have a chance of holding Israel accountable that they were prepared to be accountable themselves. That was the basis on which they went to the International Criminal Court and said, we are placing our territory under the auspices of the court, which means that all sides can and should be investigated. But we should be very clear, these are not the same violations. Occupied and occupier have different obligations, different rights. There are certain international laws that apply to everybody. One is that you can't fire on civilians. So the Israeli attacks on Gaza Strip, one of the most crowded civilian populations in the world, were illegal. The Palestinian rockets, who luckily did not kill massive numbers of people, were illegal because you can't aim them. They're too primitive. You can just kind of point them north or east or whatever. That's about as much of an aim as you can have. That makes them illegal. So there should be accountability. But an occupying force has obligations to the occupied population under the Geneva Conventions. The settlements themselves are a violation of Geneva. The settlements are a war crime. They're not just illegal in some abstract way. They are a war crime. The military assault on Gaza was a series of war crimes, attacking civilians, targeting United Nations official venues, targeting schools, targeting hospitals. There's specifics in international law that says if a military supply, if a gun is being fired from a hospital, you still can't fire on that hospital unless you can do so without damaging doctors and patients. So this was all a serious violation. That's why this move to the International Criminal Court is so important. It's far more important, I would assert, than the other move that the Palestinians made in tandem, which was to go back to the Security Council and try again to get Security Council recognition of Palestine as a state and therefore membership in the UN. That ain't going to happen. Get over it. You know, it's just not. Now, there were all kinds of issues, how they raised it the last time, the timing. You know, why did you do it 2 weeks before the end of the year when 2 weeks later you would have South Korea and Argentina, neither of whom supported the Palestinian move? They were being replaced by Malaysia and Venezuela, both of whom would support the Palestinian move. So why wouldn't you wait the 2 weeks? God knows. I mean, where that decision was made, how it was made, and why it was made, I don't have a clue. But clearly that was kind of a silly thing to do, in my view. But the bottom line is the US wasn't going to allow it to happen anyway. They didn't get to call it a veto because they didn't get the 9 minimum votes, and the US then still voted no. But it was the US that prevented it from happening. So call it a veto, don't call it a veto. It's the US stopping it. To me, that's a veto. You don't want to use the language, fine. But at the end of the day, it's a veto. That's what we're facing. The shift in discourse that I spoke of is not only happening among people around the world, it's happening among governments. The European governments have shifted dramatically. Even the UK, although they abstained, they didn't vote for the Palestinian resolution, but the French did. They didn't like the resolution, and they said so. But they said it's important that we get an agreement to end the occupation. That's what's most important. Now, it's sort of easy for them to do that, knowing that it was never going to be enforced. But nonetheless, it was a pretty brave move. Europe is not known for that kind of bravery. You know, in that period of this 24 years of US-dominated diplomacy that never went anywhere and allowed the constant exponential, thank you, the exponential expansion of settlements across the occupied territories. The European position was, Israel's going to bomb, we'll rebuild it. We'll pay for the rebuilding. Israel destroys Gaza, we'll rebuild Gaza. Israel comes and destroys Gaza again, we'll rebuild it again. Finally, they started saying, you know what? Maybe we should do something a little different. Maybe we should do something to try and stop the occupation, try and end the occupation. Now, I don't happen to think that the resolution they put forward was a very useful one. Number one, it was way too weak. Even if it had passed, there was no way to enforce it. It didn't really mean anything. All it said was, we urge in 1 year negotiations to be done. Well, okay, that's fine, but what if they're not? You know, and what negotiations, and who gets to negotiate over what? You know, it was all very not clear. But nonetheless, it was a major shift being seen at the level of governments that we had not seen before. So I want to just talk about one other thing, and then we'll open up for questions and comments and discussion. Well, 2 things, actually. One is about the International Criminal Court. That's a long way away as a solution of any sort. But I think that it's a very important move that Palestine made the determination that the court was an important institution, Now, it's a weak institution. It's a politicized institution. It has no enforcement capacity. And it was designed that way. I was at the negotiations in Rome in 1999? 8? I can't even remember. I remember Rome. I don't remember the date. Okay, 1998, when the Rome conference, it went on for 7 weeks of negotiations. And everybody knew from the beginning that the US was not going to sign on to join the court. And yet, the US had the biggest delegation there. Over 200 diplomats were there for the whole 7 weeks. They were stationed everywhere. The smoking room, the bathroom, the coffee room, the Xerox room, the phone booths. Everywhere you looked, there was some American crouched, waiting to pounce on every diplomat they could see. And what was their line? If you just weaken it a little bit, I think we can get our government to sign on. Just one more little edge back from having real power, and I think we can get it. Well, so they kept saying, well, it's just a little shift. Over and over and over again, and guess what happens? 7 weeks of negotiations, they take a vote, 121, I think, voted in favor, and 7 countries vote no on this now thoroughly weakened criminal court. And who are the 7? The US. You want to guess who our fellow resistors were? Israel. No, France and Germany were big supporters. China, Russia, Kuwait, Libya, and the UAE, as far as I know. North Korea wasn't there. So, you know, is that who we want to be in bed with when we're talking about human rights? I mean, really? So, there's no question that this is a young institution. It is not yet capable of holding accountable those who commit the most crimes. We should remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he said that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He said that decades ago, and it's more true now than ever. Will Henry Kissinger ever be held on the Pinochet precedent? Not anytime soon, and probably Dr. Kissinger, bless his heart, he's 90-something years old, he probably won't be around. Pinochet had to go and die before he could finally be held accountable. But there was an arrest. That was huge. The Pinochet precedent changed everything and said that, yes, heads of state can be held accountable. There's not the political will and the political power yet, but there's now the framework, there's the basis, there's the legality to do it. So this isn't going to go anywhere very fast. But I think, you know, it's true. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it does eventually tend towards justice if we fight for it. It doesn't by itself. The International Criminal Court will remain one of those alphabet soup institutions from the UN that nobody pays much attention to. Lots of diplomats go and, you know, live in fancy hotels and whatever, run around the world talking about it, and it won't mean anything unless we fight for it. And that's the final thing that I wanted to say, which is about what our role is as people committed to peace, committed to justice, committed now to justice in Palestine and Israel. I think it means that we have to base what we do on international law and human rights and equality for all. And if we do that, it's much easier to talk about this stuff. We're not out there saying, we stand with the heroic Palestinians against the terrible Israelis, or say we stand against the terrible Palestinian terrorists, we stand with Israel. We're saying we stand with international law. And right now, frankly, it's Israel that is by far the main violator of international law, and it's more important because we are enabling it. We're paying for it, we're buying the arms, we're providing the protection, we're allowing the impunity. That's why we have an obligation. When we look at the language, I talked earlier about the language of apartheid. Israelis call it what it is. Their discourse is a lot more free and open than ours. You know, you talk about apartheid here and some people still raise an eyebrow. Not as much. You know, that's something that's changed. 15 years ago, a bunch of us, I remember the conversation, it was here in New York actually, a bunch of us were talking about whether we should start using the term apartheid to talk about what Israeli policies look like. And a number of us, and I was one of them, said, you know, I don't think we should. Not because it wasn't accurate. If you look at what's the definition of, in international law, what's the definition of apartheid, what are the Israeli policies, et cetera, it was because people couldn't hear it yet. We'd spend all our time fighting over was that the right word or not, and that's never a useful thing. But times changed, and people learned, and more people traveled to the region and saw it. And there were changes in the Jewish community. I mean, boy, you look at an organization like JVP, the Jewish Voice for Peace. Boy, do I wish there had been something like that when I was growing up, a young Jewish Zionist in Los Angeles. We never had any alternative views. We had one view. That was it. We read Exodus. We saw the movie. We fell in love with Paul Newman. You know, what was not to like? But there wasn't any option. JVP gained 40,000 new members this summer without sending out a single appeal for people to join them because they didn't want to look like they were, you know, taking advantage of the crisis in Gaza. People found them and joined. Their rabbinical council now has, I don't know, 30 some odd people or something. It's an amazing moment, the shifts in the Jewish community, particularly among the young people. It's an extraordinary moment. And we have a lot of work to do. The US continues to use its veto at the United Nations. You know, if you look at the period between 1970 and 2007, my friend David Wildman, who works on human rights and racial justice for the Methodists, did this research a while ago. What he found was that in that period of 37 years, 50% of US vetoes cast at the Security Council were cast to protect Israel. 30% were cast to protect apartheid South Africa or apartheid Southwest Africa. So altogether, 80% of US vetoes were cast to protect apartheid. Now that's something we need to be talking about. That's something we need to challenge. So I want to leave you with one story. And that is from, it was a couple of years ago. This is a story about JVP and why they're doing such amazing work. Because there's this huge generational shift in the Jewish community. AIPAC is still powerful. They still have a ton of money. You know, they represent the right wing. The right wing always goes with the money, right? Those two things, you know, poor people vote for the left, not the right. It's sort of an old story. AIPAC has a lot of money. They don't any longer have the ability to tell members of Congress, and we will bring you the votes, you know, because they don't speak for the majority of Jews anymore. If they ever did, we can argue that one over a bottle of wine some night. But the bottom line is they certainly don't now. So a couple of years ago, there's the second largest meeting of Jewish pro-Israeli organizations in the country. The biggest every year is the AIPAC conference, 10, 12,000 people in Washington. But every year is also the Jewish Federation Council has their conference. And this one was in New Orleans, 8,000 people. And the big dinner, Bibi Netanyahu is the keynote speaker. And they're in the convention center in New Orleans. 800 tables for 10, imagine. And you look around the room, and it's like, not all, but too much of this room, which is to say a lot of folks my age and older, a lot of gray hair. And people are worried. They're bemoaning the fact that they don't have the youth. Where's the young people? But scattered around at the tables were a few young people. And Bibi Netanyahu gets up to give his speech. And he starts talking about this and that, and Israel this and Israel that. And he gets to a moment, he says, those who would try to delegitimize Israel. And suddenly a young woman stands up, and she's at a table for 10 with people she didn't know. And they had been so happy. There's a word in Yiddish my grandmother used to use. They were kvelling, which basically means they were so proud. It's what you know, it's like what a mother does with her 5-year-old at kindergarten graduation. I was kvelling over him, you know. Imagine that kind of word. So they were so proud of this young woman who was telling them what it's like growing up as a young Jew today and her work at school, and et cetera. Netanyahu gets to the point where he says, those who would try to delegitimize Israel, she suddenly stands up. She pulls out a banner from under her shirt and holds it up, and it says, settlements delegitimize Israel. And she starts shouting, the settlements delegitimize Israel. The settlements delegitimize Israel. And this silence. Everybody is frozen. The video of it is extraordinary. It's very rocky because it's somebody sneaking a cell phone video that wasn't supposed to be happening. But it goes on for like 5, 10, maybe 12 seconds. And then suddenly from her table, somebody grabs her and they kind of rough her up and they throw her out. And everybody takes a deep breath, and Netanyahu starts again. And he starts again, Israel this and Israel that. And those who would try to delegitimize, and suddenly, 6 tables over, a young man stands up. And he pulls out a banner that says, the settlements delegitimize Israel. The occupation delegitimizes Israel. And again, there's this, and you look at the faces, and it looks like terror. People were terrified of what they were seeing because these were their young. These were their young people. These are the active Jews. You know, yes, there are active pro-Israel organizations on lots of campuses. Certainly that goes on. But there is suddenly a whole new discourse within the Jewish community that is on the rise. That's who's gaining. J Street in the middle, JVP on the left, AIPAC's now on the right. When I was a kid growing up, there was AIPAC. That's all there was. There was one view. And you didn't ever think to disagree, because why would you, right? And suddenly, there's all kinds of views. People have created Open Hillel. I spoke at their conference at Harvard, I don't know, a couple of months ago. It was fantastic. 400 young activist Jews from all over the country who are very upset that their Hillel chapters have been told by the National, we welcome all opinions. We are a group for all Jewish students. But there are red lines. You may not have a speaker who talks about boycott, divestment, and sanctions. You may not have a discussion within the Hillel house about boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And these people were saying, you know what? I'm also an American. I have the right of free speech. And they created a whole new organization called Open Hillel to say, no, you don't get to tell us what we can talk about because we are part of the Jewish community too. So I wanted to leave you with that story just because I think it's an amazing one, but also because I think it's important to recognize how broad this shift is that's underway. As bad as the situation is on the ground in Syria, in Gaza, in Iraq, in Libya, throughout the region, in this country, we have some good news that has to do with people understanding things in a whole new way. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. We'll have time for some questions and discussion. The great news about the Palestinian national movement is that this BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, that came from a call from civil society, not from the PLO or the PA or Hamas or any of the factions. It was civil society organizations, women's groups, youth groups, trade unions, you know, the Doctors Association. 170 of them came together and issued that call, which is partly why it has so much support. Abbas these days, who has 2 titles, as you probably all know, he's the chairman of the PLO and the president of the Palestinian Authority, he has virtually no support at home. His most recent move to finally sign off on the papers to join the International Criminal Court won him a little bit of support. But the resolution that he put forward at the Security Council, nobody liked it among the Palestinians. It was way too weak. It was an expression of weakness. The problem is that from the beginning, the Oslo process that created the PA, the Palestinian Authority, of which Yasser Arafat was the first president and Mahmoud Abbas was elected once, his term ended 7 years ago, 8 years ago. He's been running it on an unelected basis for years now, has no real power. It's derivative power that the Israelis can give at any moment, can take away at any moment. So he can't really provide for people. When Israel decides to punish the Palestinians, as they did last week after the International Criminal Court move, by withholding taxes, there's nothing that the PA can do. So Mahmoud Abbas cannot pay the city workers, the municipal workers in either the West Bank or in Gaza. Now those tax monies that the Israelis are keeping are not gifts. They're not like Israeli taxes that they decide to give to the Palestinians and then they decide not to. These are Palestinian taxes that they're not allowed to collect themselves because they don't control their own borders, right? So if there's like a shipment of washing machines coming into the West Bank, the Palestinians can't just take the shipment as it arrives from Japan or wherever it was made, it goes through Israel. Israel collects the taxes, the VAT and whatever other taxes are involved from whoever is the manufacturer and the buyers and whatever, and it turns it over every month to the Palestinians. When they decide not to, the Palestinians have no recourse. There's no accountability. The Israelis are violating the law, but hey, who's going to hold them accountable? Nobody. So the problem for Abbas is that he has no real support. There was this effort, which succeeded in name, to create a unity government between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority that's led by Fatah. But it also doesn't have any real authority. The authority has no authority. And Abbas he's kind of a relic of a much earlier stage of the Palestinian national movement, which I think is why he was so eager to go to Paris for the anti-terrorism march. It's because he gets credit around the world for being a leader, for being the president, when he gets nothing at home. He gets bupkis. You know, he's not a president that has any power. So, you know, he's very useful for the Israelis. The Oslo process was established specifically, and the language is quite overt, it's not covered particularly in the agreements, that the Palestinian Authority's first job is to protect Israeli interests in the occupied territory. So the goal of the Israeli police authorities, the police agencies that have been armed and trained by the US in Jordan, their first job is to protect the settlers and to make sure that no Palestinian attacks any Israeli. Only secondarily is their job to protect Palestinians from crime or sort of the ordinary things that police are supposed to do. So that's the problem that Abbas faces. His official job is to be there to protect Israeli interests. So there's really no way he can serve as a representative of Palestinian interests in that context. You know, it's interesting when we talk about sort of the positions of the governments and the parties. Bibi Netanyahu's party, the Likud party, in their party platform from 1999, says explicitly that there will be no Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. And it says that Israel goes from the river to the sea. It's the old view of Greater Israel. No one ever seems to think that that's a problem. You know, we hear a tremendous amount about the Hamas Charter, which has terrible language in it. It was written in 1988, and nobody's paid any attention to it since, except for people who want to condemn it. I mean, Hamas certainly doesn't operate on the basis of it, nor, we should say, does the Likud operate on the base of their policy officially, because they don't have to. It's the policy of the whole government. The US position is two-state solution with swaps. Two-state solution with swaps. That's the official US position. And where the US is ambivalent these days, it's on the question of Israel as a Jewish state. The US doesn't use the language of Greater Israel, nor does Netanyahu these days. Some of his right-wing allies in his government do. Netanyahu doesn't. But they do now use the language of a Jewish state, which is a new thing. This had never been, this is now what the Palestinians are being required to recognize. It used to be they're supposed to recognize Israel, which they did in 1988. It's a diplomatic thing, you know, it's like the US recognizes France. It doesn't recognize France as a Catholic state. It recognizes France as a French state. It doesn't recognize Saudi Arabia as anything more than a Saudi state, even though the Saudis claim it's a Sunni Wahhabi Muslim state. So for the US position is very difficult because right now, President Obama on occasion, Hillary Clinton on occasion, which could become important or not, use the language of a Jewish state. And the problem with that is what you're asking the Palestinians to accept is the idea of a state, not just the state within the 67 borders or within some other borders, but legitimately a state privileging Jews. Now that is what exists today. There are 37, well actually a friend of mine told me it's now 50. I only know myself of 37, maybe there's 13 new laws, but there's at least 37 specific laws inside Israel, I'm not talking about in the West Bank, inside Israel, that distinguish between Jews and non-Jews, between Jews and Palestinians, that have to do with access to bank loans, has to do with citizenship, nationality rights, has to do with residency rights, has to do with marriage rights, who you can marry, where you can live. All those things are different depending on whether you're Jewish or Palestinian inside Israel. So Israel is already a state that privileges Jews. But now the Palestinians are being asked to acknowledge and recognize that Israel is a Jewish state when 20% of it are Palestinians. So they're being asked to recognize the legal discrimination of their own families, which is obviously never going to happen, but the Israeli position is, well, if it doesn't, we're not negotiating anymore and things stay as they are. So that's what we're dealing with.
Sorry, is that also applicable to Christian residents in Israel?
The Christians are Palestinians. Now, there are small numbers of Romanians and Thai workers who are not citizens who are there, but it's tiny numbers. The language in the Israeli law is Jew and non-Jew. And what's important is, because you hear a lot about Israel is a democracy, all Israeli citizens have equal rights, including Palestinians. What is true is that Palestinians have citizenship rights. They can run for office, they can vote, they're in the Knesset, they have political parties. What they don't tell you is that not all rights in Israel is determined by citizenship. There's a whole other category that's known as nationality rights. And that's where you get into the distinctions. So it's based on Jewish or not Jewish that determines these other questions. That's a very good question, the role of the Christian Zionism in the US. It's a very powerful force. It's relatively new, relative to the more traditional, older Jewish Zionist organizations. I would say Christian Zionism in the last 15 to 20 years has emerged as a much more significant force. It's particularly influential in the Republican Party. It tends to be very right-wing, as opposed to the Jewish organizations that tend to be very liberal on every other issue. It's not all or only evangelicals. There's a whole array of Christian Zionist organizations. The evangelical theology is perhaps in some ways the most shocking because it's so explicitly anti-Semitic. It's based on this idea that, because it's support not just for Israel in some generic sense, but it's support for the Zionist project of ingathering the Jews, all Jews, to the Holy Land. And it's based on a theological assumption that says that before the second coming of Christ can happen, all the Jews have to be gathered in the Holy Land, and then they will all either convert or die. And then there can be the second coming. Now, I got to say, as a Jew, that's not exactly my favorite choice necessarily, convert or die. But that is the theological basis. And when you talk to Israeli officials, why are you allying yourself with these people, for instance? Their answer is very pragmatic. Well, we know it's not going anywhere. Right now, we need all the friends we can get, so we let them raise money for us. Why not? It's really that. So they are very strong. They are very powerful, particularly within the Republican Party. Whether they're on the rise or on the decline is a very good question, and I don't know the answer. My friends in Sabeel, which is a Christian, a Palestinian Christian center in Jerusalem and has U.S. Friends of Sabeel organizations around the country, they would know that. They do a lot of work on Christian Zionism, but I don't know the answer. I'll try and find out.